Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I have another review. I just got to see the movie A Quiet Place Day 1 this past weekend. My wife and I went on a bit of a date and went to go see the movie because we've been big fans of the Quiet Place series so far in the first two movies, and we were excited to see what we would get in this kind of prequel slash part 3 type film. So without further ado, let's get ready. Let's jump into my review. So the first Quiet Place movie was, I think, one of, if not my favorite movies of that year that it came out in 2018. And then I really enjoyed A Quiet Place Part 2 as well. It was pretty much neck and neck, same level for me with Part 1. And I was really interested to see what we would get with a prequel that kind of goes back to the origins of the events that took place to kind of set things in motion for this series. Thankfully, we got a pretty competent follow-up and prequel in this series to continue the story. So in this film, we kind of follow the events following right as and right after these monsters kind of fall from space and start attacking, and just the world kind of falls into an apocalypse. And so while it is called Day 1, we really only spend a few minutes or so on that actual Day 1 before we kind of jump into the following days. So yes, it does kick off on Day 1, but we do spend most of the movie on the following days of what happened. So it's not necessarily the Day 1 that the title kind of promises, and that the movie doesn't entirely take place on that day, and so kind of loses that magic a little bit in that we have gotten to see some of the stuff that happened on Day 1. I think of Part 2 when we got to see John Krasinski's character and his family, of their response and everything that happened on Day 1 and that flashback from the Part 2 film. So we have gotten kind of tastes of it and little sneak peeks as to those events that took place, but it was cool to see all of that focused on for one film. At the helm, we have Lupita Nyong'o and Joseph Quinn as the main lead characters in this movie, and they're really great together. They have really good chemistry along the way. I thought their performances really stood above everything else in the movie, even some of my more nitpick criticisms on it, which I'll get to a little bit later in the review. But both of them were great, and I would even venture to say Joseph Quinn was a little bit better than Lupita Nyong'o was. I thought his character was just so great and interesting, while Lupita's character was the primary focus and the main character of the movie. I just thought he hit it out of the park with his performance. There's so much that has to go into a performance in a Quiet Place movie that you have to focus more on your mannerisms, your unspoken looks and glances, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of nonverbal cues that need to be given to convey a great performance in these movies. And what's really cool about the Day 1 movie is that they don't even get to rely on sign language like A Quiet Place Part 1 and Part 2 got to do. And not to say that that's a crutch for either of those movies, but I think it was cool to kind of freshen things up a bit and get to view circumstances and people in those circumstances that don't even get to rely on sign language to communicate with one another. So much of it is unspoken. At some points, they'll rely on a notebook that they have to write some messages back and forth to each other. But a lot of it is just looks and glances and just communicating through those mannerisms that we have and are able to communicate with. So I thought both of them did a fantastic job. They were really good. Performance-wise, probably the highlight of the movie for me was the performance. I thought they were really good. Moving into the production side of things, I thought the direction was pretty good as well. Nothing overly spectacular that stood out to me in a fantastic way. They did rely pretty heavily, at least to a trained eye like myself, on like volume production, virtual production kind of thing. It's pretty obvious when you have a virtual set that you're looking at, or a location or an extension of a set for a green screen, blue screen, that kind of thing. And so while I noticed it pretty frequently throughout the movie, the untrained eye is probably not going to think too much of it. And it's not that it looks bad. It looks really good. It's just kind of obvious when you're trained to look for that kind of thing, or used to looking for that kind of thing when you watch as many movies and series as I do. So necessarily not quite a criticism, but something worth mentioning at the same time. But visually, it did look really good. It's just those moments often, stood out to me as I'm used to seeing for those kinds of things. Story-wise, I thought it was okay. I didn't think there was too much of a story to latch onto throughout the film. I kind of found myself thinking it was more of a series of events that kind of connected throughout with the characters telling a story, which it is a story. There's an arc for each of the characters throughout. And like I said, they do give really good performances, the two main characters. And it was enjoyable enough. I just didn't feel like there was a ton to latch onto and relate to and empathize with for those characters. You're just kind of watching them along this journey. You got your thrills along the way, some jump scares along the way, which is what we've come to expect from this series. But overall, the story was just okay. Not nearly as compelling, I think, as it is in part 1 and part 2. I think part of that has to do with most of the events in this movie revolve around adults, where a lot of the suspenseful moments in part 1 and part 2 revolve around children. And I think stakes get a little bit higher when you bring children into the mix, because there's always that innocence of a child that we have that outlook on when viewing that type of a character. So like I said, it was a decent story, one that was enjoyable enough, but in the end, without spoiling anything, we kind of get to the end of what is the story, and I'm like, well, all that for a slice of pizza. Okay, that's not horrible, but just an observation that I made. So not quite the highs of Quiet Place Part 1 and Part 2. For me, it's still my least favorite in the franchise so far, but still an enjoyable enough movie. In the end, I gave this movie a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think it's worth checking out in the theaters. It was a really good experience. We had a decent crowd in the theater we went to. I think there was maybe 20 or 30 other people in there with us. They were all very respectful. We did have a couple cell phones going off, which happens from time to time. You just notice it more in a movie like A Quiet Place, where a lot of the movie is silent or very quiet. So overall, it was a very good theatrical experience. Definitely one I would recommend checking out in theaters if you've been a fan of the series so far. Otherwise, you can wait, check it out when it comes out and hits streaming or the Blu-ray. I'll definitely be adding it to my collection, as I like the series so far, and I would want to continue to maintain having all of those in my collection. So thank you for checking out this video and this review. I would love to hear your thoughts in the movie down below in the comments as well. So join me down there with what you thought of the movie, if you've seen it so far, where you'd rank it in the series. I'd love to continue this conversation down there. So thanks for sticking around to the end. I will see you in the next one.